Right. Good afternoon, Chair Postman, members Garrett and Vollendraw, staff and guests. The lobbies are open and the recording has begun.
Thanks, Dustin. We will convene the executive management team meeting for Wednesday, July 12th, 2023. Welcome, everybody. We are going to start today with a debrief from Dr. Kathy Hoffman, the research manager who was at the Cannabis Regulators Association conference 2 weeks ago, I believe it was now. We just always, when folks are out doing those things, we ask they come back and share what they learned and where others might be able to connect with them if they have questions. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Hoffman.
Great. Thank you very much, Chair Postman. Good afternoon, everyone. And good afternoon, Director Lucella. It's very nice to see you in this meeting today. So welcome. I've only got 20 minutes and I'll be really honest, I could probably talk about everything I learned at CANRA. It would take 2 hours, just a lot of material. So I'm going to try to distill it down and really focus on some of the major themes, some that will sound very familiar to all of you, and some of the takeaways for us moving forward. So I'll start by setting the table and kind of say a little more about the CANRA meeting. This was the second external CANRA meeting that CANRA has hosted. The first was in Seattle last year. And the stated purpose of the meeting was to bring together a diverse array of national and now international stakeholders in cannabis policy with a broad range of perspectives. And they certainly did that this year for sure. Attendees included entities that CANRA had identified as working on cannabis policy, including organizations that work on research and standards, social justice, legal issues, consumer product and safety, clinical engagement, a whole lot of stuff. So there was a lot to choose from. And then due to capacity, there were no state level trade associations, coalitions, or advocacy groups there. Individual licensees were not invited either. And to avoid outsizing, no more than 2 people from each entity could attend. Even so, it was a huge group of people, lots and lots of people in attendance. I do want to say that there were opening remarks from the Maryland Governor, Wes Moore, a really great speaker. And this was on the eve of their legalization or opening the first retail shops in Maryland. So it was a kind of monumental day for the folks in Maryland. So the sessions were set up in plenaries that started out every morning, and then there were breakout sessions every afternoon. There were 2 breakout sessions of 2 different topics each, so there was a lot to choose from. So for instance, on the first day, the first panel had to do with preparing for interstate commerce. Second had to do with new directions in cannabis policy, equity and social justice. Market dynamics was another panel. Ongoing challenges with cannabis research, and I think we're very familiar with that topic here in Washington for sure. So from these, and I had to pick and choose the breakouts I went to, so I felt like I missed out on some things. The good news is I think that most of it was recorded and should be up on the CANRA website in the not so distant future. So that's a different feature for them this year as well. But with respect to themes, I'll just run through the things that came to the surface for me. The first was potency caps and whether or not potency is even the right word to use in the cannabis space. And I know that this is something that we've talked about in Washington, and certainly we've talked about this in the rulemaking space. Economies of scale and a pretty decent discussion around the tension between large and small businesses and the impacts of vertical integration and balancing multiple interests. That was I thought that was a really interesting theme that emerged. Another one was the challenges of creating solid testing standards and packaging and labeling standards. We're all interested in product safety, but how do we figure out how to do that in a way that really benefits the customer and primarily, and more importantly, patients? Because I think that's one of the kind of driving forces behind legalization in the first place. And then I know you'll all love this. How do we really define intoxicating cannabinoid? That came up in more than one panel. And we've all grappled with that topic, and looks like others are as well. Another one that I know is close to my heart is how do we bridge the gap between research and policy development? That was a recurring theme throughout the entire conference. There was a panel on research. I'm not going to speak to that panel, but that became really evident in a lot of the conversation of the panels. And then finally, another one I know you'll love is the jurisdictional battle over hemp. That was one of the final plenaries. It was a really long one, very, I will say, fiery debate over that topic, and no surprise there. So I'm going to stop and ask if there's any questions before I talk about the 4 panels that really I wanted to share information on.
One quick one.
Sure.
Who was the fiery debate amongst on the hemp question?
There was some from the, I think it's the United States Hemp Council, representative from the FDA, and then 2 industry reps. So they had the constellation of folks who are interested in figuring out what to do with hemp on the panel, and some very decidedly different opinions on how that should move forward, which should be no surprise to anyone.
Thanks.
All right. Anything else before? And I'm trying to keep an eye on the time here. Okay, so the first panel I want to share about is, it was entitled Approaches to Better Educate Consumers and Prevent Youth Access. Excellent discussion. It was populated by a medical doctor, a gentleman who'd been in the public health and prevention realm for, I think, upwards of 35 years, a youth advocate, and then a medical cannabis advocate. And so the first question to them was, how do we regulate it from your perspective? There was a discussion around how do you create the right regulatory burden, right? What's the right way to do this? Of course, public health and prevention really leaned into providing products that aren't appealing to kids. Let's not advertise at all. And that was juxtaposed to what the advocates sort of were pushing for. I shouldn't say pushing for, but speaking to, and that was, no, we need to let the market do what it needs to do, but provide more education to kids. There was a really interesting discussion between the difference of correlation and causation in this space when we were looking at packaging and labeling. Does one cause the other, so on and so forth. Peer-to-peer education was discussed as a harm reduction effort as well. It was just let me get back to my notes here, sorry. This panel also got into a really deep discussion of creating a protective regulatory structure. That wasn't a term that I'd heard before. But public health and prevention would really like to see regulators go down that road. And then this moved into a discussion of potency and regulating potency. And this was one thing the panel did agree on, and that was, we really need to do more research if we truly want to help with medical conditions, but we also don't want to make those products less available to people who use them for different purposes. And that may be treating pain, chronic pain, symptoms related to cancer, those sorts of things. So that was I would say a really great discussion.
Kathy, can I ask a quick question?
Of course.
Can you go back and what was the term? I missed the term that you said was new to you. Can you say that one more time?
Absolutely. Protective regulatory structure.
Okay, thank you.
It's not something I've heard before. I don't know if others have, but I thought that was an interesting way to kind of think about consumer protection, and the concerns of this particular panel. The discussion around the MSO and compliance, I also thought was really interesting. The discussion around the economies of scale, and there was an assertion that this is why the tier system was created on the alcohol side. Preventing vertical integration to them had been very destructive, and that they thought that limiting the size and concentration of businesses would really help in that space. They also talked about, when they were talking about MSOs and compliance, that cannabis does not have to be a for-profit industry. I thought that was really interesting. That was really coming from the public health and prevention and medical side of the table. But then the discussion turned to, well, we're already there. How would you then suggest we put the toothpaste back in the tube? And
Why would you put the toothpaste back? What's the motivation for making it a nonprofit endeavor?
I think from the public health and prevention perspective, I think they'd like to see it, I think, kind of take the route that Canada has and go down the pharmaceutical route and um, not even allow, or I don't know if allow is the right word, but not see cannabis as something that would be termed recreational or adult use.
Huh.
Very interesting perspectives there. They also talked about how important local control is and the ability for communities to make their own decisions about what sorts of cannabis facilities they wanted to have in their communities and why. So that was, I just thought it was a really interesting panel. When they were asked what was the middle ground, universally they said, tell people the truth. But I guess it really depends on what you think the truth is. So again, a very interesting conversation. I'm going to stop. Any questions there? Okay. The next panel that I wanted to talk about was the standards for cannabis panel, and they were talking about novel ideas to improve cannabis product safety. There was a representative from ASTM, that's the American Society for Testing and Materials. I've attended some of their seminars and we've worked with them on packaging and labeling standards, primarily the universal symbol that we see on our cannabis products and a few other things. There was also a representative from AOAC, so that's the Association of Official Agricultural Chemists, and we've looked at some of their standards when we were thinking about moving forward with our cannabis testing rules a couple of years back. Well, also we've worked with Susan Audino a little bit, and she is with AOAC on product testing standards as well. They talked about the different types of standards and where they come from. So standards based in the pharmacopoeia, and those are kind of basic standards that look at things like the products that you go into when you go into a pharmacy. And again, this kind of ties back to the panel on product safety and the push to see these products in a more pharmaceutical space. So you know what you're getting every time rather than the adult use space where you sometimes don't know what you're getting. And they referred to that second standard I was referring to as the choose your own adventure standard, which I think a lot of adult use producers and processors would like to see. I thought that was kind of a funny thing. Um, they also noted that standards are great, but methods that help to create the standard, a gold standard, are really helpful. And the AOAC really focuses on method, and from state to state, methods really are very, very different, and we know that already. They talked about barriers in working with regulators, which really was important to me so I can learn how to work. We can learn how to work better with these entities. And certainly the gentleman from ASTM and I got together right away after this, since we are working in Washington to create a standard for detectable levels of THC. So that's the implementation of our THC bill. So I wanted to connect with him. And we've done that, and he's going to help with our cannabinoid science work group. So all that is great. But across the panel, they said we would like to work more closely with you on bringing data and facts together. So that's that research and operational kind of connection I was speaking to earlier. They also indicated, and I thought this was really interesting, that a lot of methods are available right now for packaging and labeling, for product testing, so on and so forth, and that they can be of service to regulators in this space. So I've already reached out, as I said, on that. They also talked about the differences between reference standards, so those are suitable for drugs, and documentary standards, which are suitable for products. And it's really helpful for regulators to know the difference between the two. And that was very helpful for me, I would say. And then also ASTM, the gentleman from ASTM indicated that their group is going to be working on defining intoxicating cannabinoid and invited regulators in the room to engage in that conversation. And I'm definitely going to pursue that on behalf of the agency. So any questions there? And I need to wrap this up. Okay. I did want to speak briefly to the transition of legacy operators and consumers into the regulated market space. But I think I'm going to gloss over that. I'll touch on that on another time. But want to talk really briefly about the consideration in U.S. federal and state policy on cannabinoid hemp products. Because that was the panel that was talking about that battle about hemp. What we're going to do with hemp. The questions asked here were really important. What should be considered an intoxicating cannabinoid? There are some who believe on the panel that this should be developed through the rulemaking process. This shouldn't be up to the federal, or it should be up to the federal government in the rulemaking process. The discussion around what's happened in Colorado came up. Their legislature listened to the lobbyists and made a way for them to comply with their members. So that was a really good discussion there. There were many on the panel that believe that this is the issue of the time that will decide which way the industry goes in the space. Another question was, what should we do with the Farm Bill? And everyone agreed that that's where the jurisdictional battle was going to happen. There was discussion about the need for Congress to get into this space and take some sort of action. I know we've talked about that. The Farm Bill wasn't supposed to be an end run around legalized cannabis. And there was one industry member who doesn't know how intoxicating gummies from hemp can even get into gas stations. So a lot of education needs to happen there as well. Very interesting discussion. Finally, I would just offer that the question came up of in 5 years, what would success look like in this space? And I think across the board, everyone said the FDA is regulating non-intoxicating cannabinoids. There is also an assertion that the FDA needed to embrace its responsibility. Someone offered that cannabis should be descheduled entirely. And I think I'm just going to leave it there. There was a lot to unpack there, far more than I can then offer in 20 minutes to you. And I'll stop.
Okay. Great. Any last questions? No. Okay, we'll let you go. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for the opportunity. And if you want to follow up, reach out. Lots to share.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Okay, next up is enforcement and education update from Director Chandra Wax.
Thank you, Board Chair. Hello, board members. Thanks for the opportunity to brief you today. It's one of my favorite parts of my jobs is getting to brag about the great work E&E is doing out in the field and in the office. So we'll start with some basic data. We talk about the number of licenses we're regulating, and I give you this number just so that we are starting from a frame of reference. So when we're talking about cannabis licenses, we know we're talking about approximately 1,750 of them. And then we're talking about liquor. We know we're upwards of 18,000. So you guys had asked for the second column where it signifies the change there. And so that was added just for your reference. When we look at the number of complaints by unit, as you know, we kind of look for some changes and then look at the reasons why for those changes to help us continue to manage our division. One of the things that we noticed looked significant this month was the jump in liquor complaints. Usually when we look into those, as you know, historically, we can tell you, oh, that was because of this policy change or because of this trend happening in the industry. But in this particular situation, we weren't able to find a particular causational factor for that. So we just had our liquor complaints jump by 20 in the month of June. Everything else runs 20, pretty standard. And then if you'll note, I'll note, just because you usually ask, in cannabis, 39% of those were internal. Much of that was driven by pesticide investigations. Number of complaints by industry, and I always like to look at what.
Question,
Oh.
question from Member Garrett. Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't see that, Ollie. Go ahead.
On the complaints in alcohol, liquor, would that have, and did you look at last June to see, is it during the month of June, July is a lot of festivals and different things going on, outdoor events? Would it be anything to do with those?
We
type
did
of
look
activities?
at to see if seasonally things trend, and there wasn't anything particular related to seasons or festivals. So hopefully we will either head back down to what's normal or be able to figure out what's causing the increase.
Okay.
Thank you, though. Great idea. So we like to look at the number of the percentage of complaints that are related directly to public safety. And as you can see, that holds fast at 76 for liquor, 48 for cannabis, and 23% for tobacco vapor. Overall, 58% of the complaints that came to us to look at were related directly to public safety. This is one slide that we just looked at internally, and I thought it was interesting, so I went ahead and left it in for our presentation. This is just looking at over time. When we dug down deeper into those liquor complaints for the month of April, May, and June, you can see that we started in 2018 at having that total of 500 complaints, and for those 3 months, and now back in 2023, we're reaching up to 300 again, with a big dip in 2022. So just looking at over time how those numbers have changed. And when we start looking at education, contacts as it compares to warnings, NTCs, notice to corrects is that acronym, and AVNs, administrative violation notices. We're on target over on the left for our education contacts to have more contacts than we did in 2022 this year. And then we are running about consistent for warnings. That notice to correct tool is being used more, which we expected to see after the legislation gave us that tool. And then AVNs are running pretty standard, in line with what they were last year. When we look a little bit closer at education, you can see first and second quarter number of educational contacts were just about the same. So that work is staying consistent out there, which is exactly what we want to see. And then we start breaking down those education contacts by industry. Obviously, the dark blue and light blue are 2021 and 2022 in total, and then 23 numbers are in dark gray year to date. You can see that the number of liquor education contacts is going to far exceed last year, and then the same for cannabis, and tobacco vapor is running a little bit low, and I would suspect that's just due to numbers on that team. And then specifically when we look at licensee education by month, just the last few months, you can see April, May, and June, the work that our officers are out in the field doing to make sure we're providing that education and information to our licensees. And then we added consultants to this one, so you could see the work specifically that our compliance consultants are doing with our licensees.
Can you go back one slide for a second?
Yeah.
Sorry. So I'm just trying to see if there's, I'll look at it later. I don't need to take your time now. Thank you. Go ahead.
No worries. Thanks. Thank you, Dustin. And then we like to look at those top 5 topics for our contacts with licensees. And so for education, you can see that they're reaching out to make sure we're working with people on regulatory topics, youth access, public safety issues like over service, and youth access, and licensing permits and new licensee support. And then on the right side, that's broken down by industry as well. But we are getting out there and chatting with people, with our licensees, about things that are important to them. When we look at a violation breakdown, so when we start to move from the education tools to some of those enforcement tools, you can see the number of AVNs versus the number of warnings in blue for liquor and tobacco vapor. And then we're using that additional tool of the notice to correct in cannabis, just to document the contact and to give people a little more time to move from that education to that enforcement phase of compliance. We looked at the topics for notice to corrects in the cannabis industry, advertising, non-compliance with record-keeping requirements, failure to maintain the required surveillance system, failure to maintain required insurance, and then the failure to use traceability correctly. One of the things that I'm looking at when I'm looking at this data is those things that are public safety are really the things we should see AVNs about. And as we move into warnings and NTCs and education, they should be more along the lines of regulatory topics like we're seeing here.
But wouldn't,
Chandra, on the advertising, what is it that we are seeing that they are doing or not doing?
So many of these NTCs and education contacts that we're having as related to advertising are related to signage, and the majority of those are related to complaints that we're following up on.
So somebody calling in complaining about the signage?
A lot of times there's a competitive spirit to the industry that when they want to make sure everybody's following the rules and the rules are being enforced consistently. So oftentimes it's if a licensee may mention that someone else is not following the rules, sort of thing.
go ahead.
No, I just know in the past and in the beginning of things, when it came to advertising, it used to be based on the size of a billboard or different other things. And I was just wondering, what is it
signage,
now?
billboards, and yes, signage. I just used a different word, I think.
Signs.
Yeah.
Size of
and location.
signs.
Number of signs, right?
Number of signs, what's on the signs.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Well,
Sorry if I wasn't specific enough.
No, I think that's well, I think signage is a topic of a good topic of conversation. But you said that you look for education contacts and notice to correct on kind of non-public safety things. But this one, help me understand though, shouldn't we be seeing the same sort of things? Because we should be seeing potential public safety things on NTC that get resolved, right, before they go to
Yes.
AVN. So
we do see those.
how many of these on the top 5 would you consider public safety?
I wouldn't consider any of these a first-time AVN violation.
Yeah,
unless...
so that's and when you look we still have, anyhow, that's always been something that I've been trying to figure out, because we would ideally want to see so half our complaints relate to public safety issues on cannabis, about half, and half of them are not. But when you look then, that it seems we're spending a lot of time on these non-public safety ones through the warning, NTC, and then some do go to AVN. But why
so
don't
if I
we see
could,
more of them here?
when the regulatory items come to us through complaints or internally generated issues, much of the time we will address those with education. And so what happens is, after a period of time, like we talk about, When we can't work together to find compliance through education, we'll start looking at warnings or notice to corrects. These are still important to regulating cannabis, but they don't necessarily reach a public safety need to be corrected now, or there's a risk to public safety level. So the NTC we can use when we have attempted repeatedly to gain compliance through education, or like you said, we need to get compliance immediately because it's veering on the edge of a public safety issue. We can use an NTC to do that. And I can start looking at stats of how many NTCs carried over to AVNs. But what you'll see when we get to AVNs, we just aren't issuing a large number of them in the cannabis industry.
Right, and we're able to settle them and things, the process I think works well. It just, could one then surmise that we're not using NTCs on public safety as much as we do on non-public safety, that there aren't many public safety violations, maybe, although half the complaints are public safety violations. But we're
And
not
I think, David, that's where I was getting ready to kind of lead to and kind of throw up that. Let's say, for instance, public safety is selling to a minor. And do we look at things, or do we want to look at things like it's a retailer, they've never had a complaint. We were doing underage whatever check, and the retailer has everything properly in place for ID check, the whole 9 yards. And based on an employee on this particular instant came in and was able to purchase and whatever, do we immediately do AVNs on something like that, or do we pull the owner aside to say, hey, you've never received a violation, you got everything in place, this just occurred with this underage person, and the person sold anyway? Do we do anything like that? Was just one example that came to mind.
Ma'am, when it comes to youth access, we would do both. We would talk to the licensee, we would provide education, we would talk to the clerk that made the sale, we would provide education, and we would issue an AVN for a public safety violation.
What we don't do is you give warnings only. We don't give warnings on failure on compliance checks.
Nor should we, in my opinion.
That's right, sir.
Right, but we do.
One of the things, I'm sorry, go ahead, David.
I was just saying, we do often end up with a compromise on those where they have a reduced penalty. So we do mitigate the penalty often if they do some of those things that Member Garrett was just talking about, do all the right things. They have the opportunity to mitigate that penalty, but we don't ever say to anybody, you sold to a minor this time, don't do it again without an AVN. But the AVN in the end could be sort of bargained down, negotiated down to a lesser penalty.
Absolutely. And the other thing I can do as a follow-up, oftentimes what we're looking at here, not oftentimes, every time, are just the top 5 things that we're utilizing NTCs for. So I can take a deeper dive into the data and look at how much are we issuing NTCs for public safety situations, and are we utilizing them as a stair step to AVNs? How often is that happening, or is this typically resolving the situation?
That would be helpful. And just one last question for you on this subject, which is when you look at that, half the complaints are for cannabis are public safety, or we'll look at the half that are not. How much, so how much of this is out of our hands? We have a stated priority of focusing on public safety violations. That's our, public safety and public health are our mission. We've evolved in this, et cetera, et cetera. How much of this, though, is complaint driven and then out of our hands?
I would say as for the example that board member Garrett brought up, when we start talking about youth access and protecting our youthful consumers, or should not be consumers,
Yeah.
we that's out of our hands. That's certainly something, and that's pretty much the numbers we're seeing for AVNs in the
But
cannabis
that's out of our
industry.
hands on the public safety. I'm saying how much that, like, if we wanted to say to you, we wish we spent more time on public safety violations and less time on the others, but half your complaints are non-public safety.
Yeah.
What do we do?
So 42% of that is out of our hands.
Right, okay, that's because we still have to do something with that complaint.
Yeah,
'Cause
we could, we can do priorities, but we certainly don't want to just stop looking at certain complaints.
No, and I'm not suggesting we do anything at this point. It's just that really jumped
Yeah.
out at me today in particular, just because I've been thinking a lot about public safety violations versus others, and those stats are interesting. But I know when we get to what happens on final adjudication on these things, the system is working well in terms of mitigating and resolving at the lowest possible level. So I'll let you get to the next ones.
That's okay. Thank you for the questions. Thank you, Dustin. So when we do start to look at administrative violations, you can see consistently that the top 5 categories are sales to persons under 21 for the items we issued an AVN administrative violation on. And then in liquor, you can see that, and tobacco and vapor, all of our AVNs were directly related to under 21, except for there were 2 in liquor for overservice or a sale to an apparently intoxicated person. And so those are all really solid public safety violations. And then warning topics, you can see that we can always tell when our tobacco vapor team is out there working on their checks, because you see that that master services agreement is hitting the top of the list. And then operating without a valid license, serving over, closing time, tax related issues, and failure to use and maintain traceability. So you can see that they're out working a variety of issues and using warnings to help get to compliance in those issues. And then this is what you were talking about, David, when we look at the alternative resolutions. I would just highlight again that we've been 12, I think 14 months now without any of our resolutions from cannabis being forward to a formal hearing. And I did ask yesterday when we reviewed this data, I said, I just want to make sure that we're not going to take a look at this and figure out there's some data point we're missing over the or an email box we're not checking or something for 14 months. So that's not the case. And they really are doing a great job at resolving those prior to getting to formal in both cannabis and liquor. We start looking at the data for youth access. When we look at liquor compliance, we did 221 checks in June. I don't know how they consistently do such a weird number, the same 2 months in a row, 221, but they have to do that on purpose. And our compliance rate was 79% for the month of June in liquor. Moving on to talk about our favorite topic, delivery and curbside. We didn't have any delivery checks in June. And I just wanted to point out, in talking with staff directly, our compliance rate's 66% there for curbside. So those are licensee curbside deliveries. But I also want to say that we're having difficulty finding folks that will do delivery when we're out there doing these types of compliance checks. So sometimes it's difficult to find people that are even working with third-party deliveries or their own employees to do the delivery. So there has been an impact on the industry when it comes to the work we've been doing with in the delivery market. When we start looking at cannabis compliance for youth access, we are at 93% for the month of June. I do want to say cannabis typically has a higher compliance rate. And we looked into data a little bit more on this because it is 93%. And as you know, we've been doing our compliance checks a little bit differently. We've been assigning them at random rather than having officers and teams choose which licensees they're going to go to for compliance checks. And we ended up in this last batch with more sales with our tribal retail partners. And so we did actually have 5 locations and 6 sales there. And it came up that there was a lack of clarity on what happens with the penalty in those cannabis retail stores. So we've just been working in partnerships with those retailers and of course the tribal organization and our tribal liaison to just work through that and try to ensure that that's not an avenue for youth access. And then tobacco and vapor compliance is up to 87% for the month of June. When we start looking at premise checks, you can see just really briefly the number of visits that our officers and compliance consultants are making to each of these industry locations to have contact education or enforcement with our licensees. You can see cannabis has visited 65% of their locations year to date, and liquor is at 42%, tobacco vapors at 27%. So we are still maintaining a presence in our licensee establishments. And then just looking at ID checks for youth access as we continue, as in the summer months, as we're prioritizing some of those daytime events and maybe not, and doing our compliance checks and getting those done. You can see that maybe our nighttime presence and youth access ID checks aren't quite as high. You'll notice we had some legislation change there in the tobacco vapor arena that has resulted in fewer number of checks in that area. That's okay, Dustin, go ahead. And then our CRI unit, the criminal history and records information, continues to support several other divisions, HR and licensing and E&E, as we look at license renewals and fingerprinting for employment. And then our top 5 examiner requests for June are related to pesticides. We're watching this officer request number, remember, as we brought them into the enforcement division, and hope that they will partner in cannabis and be able to support looking at traceability numbers and how that works out for the division working with that examiner team. And then of course, continuing to support CCRS and traceability questions. And then this is our FDA team. So again, we're getting an additional 774 inspections, and their compliance rate is running at 79% for the tobacco and vapor sign-R checks that they've been doing. And as always, to be transparent about our internal affairs, we had 1 additional complaint in June that was unfounded. So there was no other outcome to report there. Hiring and recruiting remains something we're working really hard on and doing a ton of out of the box as much as we can work on recruiting and getting officers in the academy. Thank you, Board Member Volendroff, for attending those graduations. We have one tomorrow. We have 14 in background, so that's great news. And then we're just continuing to do a lot of training so that our officers are staying on top of some of the legislative change and making sure that we retain the training that's required for our certification as well. Jim.
You're muted, Jim.
Sorry about that. I was wondering about the impact of the vacancies on our ability to do education contacts, compliance checks, all of these things. If you could just give me an idea. I mean, when I look at the numbers, it's hard for me to tell. Like, if we were fully staffed, would we be doing X number of more, premise checks and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just really wondering, I am concerned about us being able to actually fulfill our public safety mission when we've got continued vacancies in enforcement. And so that's kind of where my question's going.
in brief, what I'll say is we are triaging those complaints as they come in, and those that are related directly to the safety of our public and consumers. We are obviously prioritizing and following up on, and then some of those things that would likely end in education anyway, we are resourcing to our education team to follow up on. So we are doing what we can to make sure that the regulatory topics, the things that are still important to regulating the industries, are getting followed up on. We just are using compliance consultants to follow up on some of that.
So what gives though? I mean, it does something give. So for example, I'm thinking we just had the All-Star game, and with the All-Star game, there was like 4 or 5 days of events in which alcohol was served. In the summertime, as Ollie mentioned, we got more concerts, we got more outdoor events, we have all these different things. The Kraken did really well, so we had extra games. So do we send less people to those events because we don't have the staff? I mean, is there an impact there?
Yes,
Okay.
we send less people to those type of things. We were at the All-Star games, and we probably don't attend every Kraken game, or we don't attend every Mariners game. We try to make sure that we're present and are keeping track that what they're doing is in compliance with what they told licensing and the agency they were going to do. But the reality is, what gives is sometimes the citizen that called in to report something that's regulatory in nature and maybe not public safety, we don't get to that right away or maybe ever.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dustin. I think I am at the end. I just wanted to point out, I have a whole list here. I won't go through the whole thing, but lots of partnerships with finance to talk about electric vehicles, working with licensees for things like the All-Star games, Target Zero participation with the Traffic Safety Commission. I'm working with licensing on the DISBIS policy, with our tribal liaison and the tribes to prevent youth access. Excited to work with Kathy and Cassidy as we look forward to rules and research team, working with finance on direct ship and their wine and beer tax, and then doing some job shadowing with tobacco tax and finance too, and communications to review our internal and external communications. So lots of partnerships happening, and I didn't want to go without mentioning that, but I know questions took me over time, and I apologize.
Yeah, we'll apologize for the questions.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And we'll turn to Mark Webster, our Legislative Director, for an update.
Hello, good afternoon, Chair Postman and members Garrett and Vollendroff. I don't have much today on the legislative front, not a big surprise given the month that we're in, but do want to pass along that the thing that I'm hearing a lot from legislators is just when can we sit down and meet with Will? There is a real interest in this change, and I think that's a good thing to see. I think it's a very positive sign. I'll do another update on the legislative implementation tracker at the next EMT.
Okay.
So in the meantime, just some ripple effects kind of coming out of the session on a couple of things that we can just talk about. As you can imagine, there's still plenty of interest in the DDE issue. So all of the information that was presented in caucus and then went out, that's really helpful. So really want to thank the great work from E&E that we're able to kind of get that out. And I think you called it Chair Postman, but I think there was a lot of interest all of a sudden in the issue of biometric age verification on the part of those members who had been working on data privacy and health privacy legislation, including this last session. So we're going to be having some meetings on that. I think there's still a lot of interest in the nuances of the alcohol delivery bill 5448 that's kind of coming along with the rulemaking as that's going. So I think that just means we're going to see a repeat of that very likely on the cannabis side once the rulemaking around the THC bill comes along. So I think we're almost at the point where we'll start to be hearing a lot about our partners' legislative agendas. And we have more to share on that from our point of view soon, and look forward to working with the board on that. Finally, just to mention it, there is a Senate Labor and Commerce Committee hearing tomorrow, but there's nothing on the agenda really relating to our work. It's more on the labor side. So that's one. Good.
Thank you for that. Licensing with Director Becky Smith.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'll try to get through this a little quicker, and let me just start with saying that our cannabis and licensing units are engaging in some improvement projects, and we're doing that to reduce some timeframes that we've seen in both liquor and cannabis, and also hoping to provide some better customer service for our licensees. It hasn't gone without its bumps, of course, and so let me just start with liquor. That this is just a a view of how many, we wanted to see how many applications we received in 2022 from April to June, and then again from April to June for 2023. As you can see there was a slight decline in the number of applications we received, but we wanted to start somewhere with a number. And then next you see here that it's important for customers to receive a phone call as soon as they were assigned an investigator. And what we've seen in practice was that maybe it was 4 days, 5 days before an investigator would be assigned. And so we put out expectations that we wanted our investigators to reach out to their customers within 2 days. And that changed the look of how, that when interviews were happening. And so instead of interviews taking, maybe 14 days or 8 days, that they started decline, because as quick as a customer could get one of our investigators on the phone, then they were asking to set up a time to actually complete the application and the process. So I think that's a good thing. I think the customers have also provided some feedback that they like knowing who their investigator is really quickly in the process. Next, you'll see here that we started to also look at how long it took us to complete an application, for good reason, because I'm going to talk about the pilot in a few minutes. But you can see here that 60 days, and that's our goal, is to complete the whole process within 60 days. That 377 were done in 60 days. And then here we have 189 from 60 to 90 days. And the ones that are always the most concerning to me, of course, is anything over 90 days. Like, why is that taking so long for us to issue a license? And so with that, we asked the question. I've asked the question about why it's taking our investigators so long. Is it our process? Is it something that our customers could do better with? And so you'll see here. Oh, sorry, I'll stop.
You got a question? Yeah, from
Jim?
member.
Yeah, I just had a question. I was wondering, Becky, can you help clarify for me? Is this all applications, or are they bucketed into special short-term things or new liquor licenses, or how are applications defined in this context?
They're all applications.
Okay.
So all of
So
our
we don't
applications.
triage them in any way, like some are quicker, and so therefore we act on those first. They all kind of in the same order in which they come in, or whatever?
They're in the same order when they come in, but in the pilot, we make that change. So in the pilot, we do specifically concentrate on certain license types that seem to be easier, because we also assign licenses depending on, we have licensing investigators, and then we have senior investigators. And the senior investigators are those investigators, and there's only 4 of those, and we've increased the staffing. We've taken staff from other units and put in our liquor units, because we've seen an increase in the number of applications that are coming in. But those senior investigators take on more difficult files. So maybe files where there's questions on whether or not we should license somebody. And so those files take a bit longer, because there's several layers of folks that look at those files, including myself.
Great, thank you.
And then here we have, we ask the question, why are these taking longer when they're 60 to 90 day to process? And the largest reason here is, you can see almost half of these folks don't turn in their photos. And a while back, we made some changes in our process, because what we were seeing and receiving some concerns was from our enforcement arm. And they were saying, why would you guys license these folks? And what was on the floor plan and what enforcement saw was two different things. And so just, that in order to help us really see what we're licensing, we require photos going forward. We've also, from time to time when we still have concerns because we clearly aren't seeing the whole premise, that we'll have enforcement go out and take a look at a premise. And it has helped in some cases for us not to move forward with the license, or it has helped with us requiring more from a licensee as well. Now, here's where we talk about talk a little bit about the pilot. So back, if you guys remember, Mark will remember this, that we received a question from a senator as why we couldn't process applications in a quicker fashion. And so we came back and I said, why can't we, let's look at 45 days. Why, what's the barrier in getting that done in 45 days? So we thought we'd start with probably the easiest license types. And for us, the easiest license types are taverns, beer, wine licenses, snack bars, that we wanted to see whether or not we could get those done in 45 days. We've assigned 6 folks, licensing investigators, specifically to work on those license types. And what you see here is that in those months, we've assigned 111, 15 have been issued, and 27 withdrawn. We'd like to see less of those withdrawn. I will share with you that right away before we even, as the assignment goes out, that all of these folks receive a letter from licensing, letting them know the process that they're going to be going through and the requirement of the 45 days. That if they have concerns because this is a big build out, because sometimes it's 2 years until someone would actually have their building up and ready to go. And then sometimes they haven't even filed for any of their permits. And we know right now and that permitting is taking a longer period of time for folks. And so we give folks an opportunity to pull out and not have to go through the process if they feel like they're not going to be able or capable of getting their license issued within 45 days. If towards the end we can't make that happen, that of course there's paperwork that we'll be able to use again if it takes longer. If they call us and say, hey, we've almost have everything done, it's going to be over 45 days, we work with everyone. I just want to make sure that the board knows that we're not like 45 days, you're done, that there's always some type of a reason to, that we might be able to work with somebody and give them a few more days. So then here's our cannabis unit. I will tell you that back in January, that what we saw was that we had a number of licenses that were just sitting there, applications that were sitting there, not 100 days, but maybe like 2 years during the pandemic. And so that myself, manager, and the supervisors really worked on what this process needed to look like and how we could clean this up. You can see here that we've really made some changes in April and June, that that what we were looking at is trying to complete applications within 60 days. That really is our goal, is to have applications received or completed within 60 days. Keeping in mind that these are not brand new applications. We don't have any really brand new applications when it comes to producer, processor, retailer, that certainly somebody could buy a business and it feels like a brand new application to the investigator, but we're talking about change requests. So somebody who's maybe moving to a new location, maybe changing ownership. Small change requests, of course, go to our customer service, but these are big change requests.
We mean licenses issued? So
Yes.
but that's what we're talking about, right? That means
Yes.
to the point where they get it in their hands.
Correct. And then here you'll see that these are reasons that files were over 90 days. And this is actually percentage. This is like 13 files that are over 90 days. Back in January, when we started this process, we had 83 that were over 90 days. And now the fact that and actually it's a lower number, I think it's 11 now, but we made significant progress in this area of getting folks issued. And then, of course, this is from assignment to build out, that, as you can see here, that it really has changed as far as new build out, and no build out at all happens really quickly. And with build out, it tends to take a bit longer, of course, because of the permits. I also want to mention back to, you don't have to change the slide, Dustin, but I wanted to mention when it comes to cannabis, the other thing that we saw in June was that the city of Pasco lifted their moratorium and ban. This is fantastic. We haven't seen a moratorium or ban lifted in quite some time. That gave us the ability to, there are 3 title certificate holders in Pasco. So they have 6 months in order to get licensed again. So we notified those folks. We let them know that what they needed to do in order to reinstate their license. And some of them have begun that process already. Now with customer service, Ollie?
I was gonna ask, did that impact the social equity? Was some of them social equity applicants? Do we know?
Could could they be social equity applicants? Yes. So any of the folks that had title certificates could have also applied to move. I don't know that any of them are. That I don't know.
Right. Yeah, I knew they could. I was just saying, do we know if any of those had applied under social equity to get, because some of them, they wanted to be able to move.
Right. I don't.
Okay. You don't. Okay.
So next is customer service. Well, I will share is that right now is our busiest time of the year. And you know that from March to October is when we have a significant number of special occasion licenses happening or events happening that that we've processed. Oh my gosh, it feels like we've processed a million of these. That you can see here that we have 45 days in which to process one of these licenses. We do it really quickly. I will tell you that even as of today, where I received a phone call for an event that's happening this weekend, it's almost impossible to turn around an application that quickly. But certainly they're all for good causes because they are nonprofit. Well, I shouldn't say they're all for good causes, but they're nonprofits. It's a way for folks to raise money, but that our customer service staff work really hard to make sure that these are done in a timely manner. With customer service this past June, they also had an offsite where they met with Oriya. And Oriya is all about small businesses. And what's so great about them is that they were able to provide our team with information about, how they can help a business, how they can help a business navigate both the state system, the county system, what the federal regulations are as well. So I think it was a good outreach for us to have Oriya come and join that customer service meeting. And then policy and education, I will tell you that of course, with the responsible vendor program, we're also always trying to reach out to get more stores involved in the training. And that staff have. There's 2 of these staff. They've reached out and at least have 25 more stores that are registered. That's a positive thing, especially when it comes to IDing folks and being aware of the requirements. With that, our training team has also done a lot of work with S&P, even though S&P didn't go live originally, like it was originally going to, that we still did all of the training. Our staff were still, looking at when the release was going to happen, what training needed to happen as well. And I would say that 100% of our folks were trained and feel good. And we're going to be providing some more training before the release happens, before the first release happens. Also with education and training, we have done a lot of work, and Mark mentioned this, Chandra mentioned it, but with Senate Bill 5448, when it comes to that best practice that for delivery, that I will tell you that this has been a good collaboration between enforcement and licensing. We've trained both our liquor staff, our customer service staff, our enforcement staff, and we trained them together. That we've also done all of the changes for all of the forms that you'll see on the internet, as well as sending out information to any of those licensees that held the endorsement, to notifying them of what kind of changes are going to happen. So, that it's still very confusing for folks. I will say that this certainly hasn't been an easy bill to, to work through, but both rules and licensing, enforcement, and Mark have done a great job. And so with that, I do want to do one more update, and that's about social equity. That as I hope all of you by now have had at least a chance to meet Aaron Washington. He's our new social equity manager. I'm super excited to have him on board. He keeps saying he's drinking from the fire hose and constantly, that I want him to be a year in, and he's 3 weeks in. So he's learning a lot. That we are going to be doing a presentation to the board around the process next Wednesday. That we want to make sure that both the community out there understands what these next steps look like in this next couple of months, and sort of what to expect from as Ponder finishes up reviewing all of these applications. So at the same time, I will say that we have one process happening, and we're going to be standing up another process. And so we've already begun that it's not, we don't stop and start. So we've already begun getting a group together. I've established a work group. It has everyone. It's different than the time that we did it before. And I will say it's a good difference for certainly, it'll be a good difference for the agency, in that we have everyone involved in this program, that sitting at the table with figuring out how we need to implement is our, representatives, of course, from licensing, but finance, communication, rules, research, IT is going to be joining us. Finance is joining us as well, because it touches every piece of our organization. We've already met with the Office of Equity. We did that last week. That we wanted to make sure that we have input about our DIAs, and they have that information for the disproportionately impacted areas ahead of time, what's in the new law, where they could provide feedback on how we might be able to receive data. They're also going to be looking at our scoring rubric, at our process, how we communicate, and how we can better engage the community. They have been very welcoming. I will tell you, it was a fantastic meeting, as well as we've also sent a letter. I recently sent a letter out to OMWB, letting them know about what pieces that how they play in the work of 5080 as well. So again, lots of work happening with social equity, both with the current process and the process that we're going to be rebuilding. And there's a lot of input that we'll be receiving from the community, and will want to receive from the community about the process.
Right. One thing I would ask in that, since it does touch all corners, including the board, because as you know, well, we hear from folks as well and have our opinions. If in that process, what I would like is the opportunity to maybe talk to some of that, you and some folks early in the process, to sort of, here's what I've learned and what I would like to see maybe differently. And then obviously find some way, once we get drafts and things, to hear what others are thinking. But I'm sure the other two board members would appreciate that opportunity too, because we hear from people every day on this subject.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should have mentioned, I didn't when I included everybody, that that board member Garrett is involved in all of those meetings as well. She's part of our group.
Right. Okay. Any other questions for licensing? No. Okay. Thank you. We will turn to communications. Brian Smith.
Thank you, Chair Postman, members Garrett and Vollendroff. I'll hit some of the highlights. I usually start off with what we're seeing in the media that continues to kind of trickle in over the last couple of months. It's been fairly slow. We're seeing at least one or two come through a day, though. Some of the highlights, there was some reaction to the DDE message, Chandra's message that went out I heard immediately, well, actually, I reached out first to the AP, but we've had several conversations because Jean at the AP has been covering this and following it for some time. And I do expect something to be coming out of that soon, based on the conversations that we had, and he's having conversations with others out there. So a little bit more on DDE, as well as some localized publications that I've talked to about the issue, helping to just trying to understand and what that means. Mark, you provided some information that's in the state budgets. That was helpful, I think, to everyone I talked to, is that they knew that the legislature provided some funding to help some of those local producers. And then just I made a note of this about the biometric data. That's been covered a little bit in the media. I don't know if you've seen any of that stuff, but the Columbian, I don't know if it was an original article or not, but they were following the actual board meetings and what was being said, and et cetera. So there's some out there that are following that from a privacy concern, I guess, in that sort of way. On the social equity front, Becky really covered it really well. Just so you know, is that I will be working with her on kind of the development of an outreach plan as to what that'll look like. So your comments were well made. I understand that with the board and how we might work all that into a plan. So that's in the early stages, but that'll be coming together fairly quickly. I shared with some staff today and with you, David, a video that Sam produced from beginning to end on social equity, where we are now, what 50/80 implementation is going to mean. I don't expect that's going to be the end all of education of what answer people's questions, but it's a nice thing to be able to have. We're going to put it in our newsletter that'll be going out shortly. So that'll be going out in next week. I believe we'll be issuing the newsletter. But anyway, it's coming soon along with a number of other topics. On the camera front, you've heard me talk about my involvement with the PIOs before, et cetera. Some things that Kathy may not have seen that might have been evident if anyone else was there, is that there was some media interest, or at least some concern going on in camera, when at the last minute, I think it was the governor of Maryland wanted to have his remarks not be private. And so there was suddenly a lot of consternation about how we make this part private on stuff. And I was slightly involved, at least in that I'd provided the talking points for how to deal with that, but kind of working through some concerns that I know that Jillian had at the time, and others at Canada as to the changes. So I had a meeting today with the larger public education team of Canada that Jillian was a part of. She kind of did her debrief from her perspective as to how things went, and take a look at how Canada is going to approach these meetings in the future. And so there's going to be more discussion about this. I had a small conversation with David about it, about what that might look like, down the road, and what the communications role of that might be down the road. So it's difficult to do communications sometimes, when it's a closed meeting, et cetera, and what can you do and what can you make available. But that goes on. As the second half of that meeting today with the Canada team was talking about some things I thought was really relevant to our work here, on social equity and others. And it was about reaching out and accessing, or being able to communicate with what they call underserved populations, or what I had called previously, hard to reach audiences. And had some really good, it was a really good conversation. It was very robust, and it was some helpful stuff and some things that I think that I can follow up with. And I had some things to contribute as well. So I thought I feel good about how and where that is going, and see where we go from there. And then you heard me mention the newsletters, cannabis next week, alcohol within 10 days. We've got some robust content that'll be going out in that. The legislative fact sheet, something Mark did not mention, is that Mark did the heavy lifting on writing summaries of all of the type of legislation that affects our stakeholders, affects the staff here as well. And so we did a final edit of those, posted them online, so they're available. We'll be notifying stakeholders of that when we go out with the newsletter. And I think Mark's planning something for staff as well to be coming out. Okay. And then one kind of side note here is that something kind of fell in my lap that wasn't there a week ago, but it was the project, and I don't think Tony's going to cover any of this, so she probably talks about SMP, but as part of the project, translation services was going to be part of basically everything in the portals needs to be translated into Korean, Spanish, and to Russian. And really, I mean, these requirements are not essential to the project. They're more, how is the agency approach to translation services? And so I had pushed to take that out of the project, and that I would take the lead on taking a look at how we would do this as an agency. I'm already the contract manager with a firm that handles translation services for us, and they can do all that. But we want to have a plan that's going to be workable for all the divisions, for the agency, and how we approach translation. I talked to the DSHS. I mean, there's an agency that has life and death and a number of non-English speaking groups that they need to work with. And we're more limited in that, but I want to take a strategic approach to translation services. Something every agency deals with. In my career, I've certainly known that it's tough to be able to stay on top of. And then just lastly, we'll let Tony talk about SMP, but I just always want to pat Julie on the back because she gets lost in so much of our stuff that we do in communications because she's got her nose down in the project constantly, and she's doing a great job there. I had really good things with her. I had a good conversation with the QA folks the other day. Very complimentary of her. Yeah.
So I would second that. I think she does great. I'm really glad she's at the table with us. Yeah,
Great. Thank you.
it's helpful. Thanks. Okay. Deputy Director Tony Hood.
Thank you, Chair Postman and members Garrett and Volendroff. The first thing I'll start with is just to let you know we're preparing our supplemental budget requests. Rachel, our CFO, is working with other division directors and other staff members and with Mark to figure out what we're going to put forward. We have some unfunded FTEs that we'd like to ask for more funds for, some operational expenses. Nothing super surprising or unusual. There are some IT supplemental requests. They kind of go down a separate path and have to be analyzed separately. But George is working with Rachel on those. So those are due mid-September, I believe. So we'll proceed with those. We have 2 RFIs out right now, requests for information. The first one is regarding our tax and fee replacement system, which is something we knew we would have to replace. And we're waiting to see what kind of responses we get. It's possible someone will respond with something that fits in with our Salesforce platform. We just simply don't know what kind of information we'll get back. It would be nice if that happened, I think, if we got a response that would work with what we have, but we'll just have to wait and see what's out there in the market and whether it will work. But that's been a long time coming that we would do that RFI. And the other RFI that we have out there is for the future of CCRS. It's the cannabis traceability. So both of these RFIs, the responses are due back at the beginning of August. So the tax and fee is August 1st. The cannabis traceability is August 3rd. So when we get those back, they'll go through the regular process from there. And I'll keep monitoring those because they could have an effect on the SMP project. And we have to be very careful about how we approach those and how they affect the whole agency, and that we don't overcommit to a contract with another vendor that we could be bound by, and that could affect our ability to move forward with SMP. We have a very heavy lift between now and release 2 with SMP. We can't overtax our people, and we already have a contractual obligation with Accenture for the SMP project. We, regarding the SMP project, as you all know, we weren't able to roll out in June as we wanted to. We had issues, which I won't go into detail with, but it was kind of a mini roller coaster regarding what the issues were, whose issues there were, and how they could be fixed. I'm glad that the team stuck to their guns, so to speak, and made sure that Salesforce found the root cause of the problems and fixed them. They fixed them last week. We are doing our internal UAT testing this week. So far, everything's going fine. No bugs, no problems this week. So we are currently on track to do release 1 on July 19th. And so this will put us behind for release number 2. at least 3 weeks, but I anticipate it'll be more. And that means that other projects have to be looked at down the road as we push to the right. Release 2, we have to look at other projects. And the next time I come to EMT, I will have an agency project mural for you, and it will give a long-term timeline that looks into 2024 for all of our projects, including 5080, which Becky mentioned, social equity. And it will include where we're at with the RFIs and those timelines for CCRS traceability, tax and fee system, of course, S&P. There are other things I'm forgetting, any website implementation that might affect the rest of the agency. And then social equity has always been up there and continues to be up there. The social equity that's in play right now with Ponder, et cetera. So we need to look at the whole picture of the agency projects together. And so you'll have that update next EMT. That's all I have for today.
Good. Great, thank you. Any questions from the board? None. Okay. We will move to director's comments and welcome our brand new director as of 3 days ago, Will Lucella. He's joining us remotely today, but he'll be in the chair here soon. Welcome to executive management team, Will.
Well, thank you very much, Board Chair Postman, board members Garrett and Vollendroff. Things have been extremely busy the first 3 days. I've been engaged in all types of meetings, some onboarding conversations with staff. Very, very excited to be part of the LCB team. And so I look forward to continuing this collaborative approach.
Great. Well, we're all excited to have you here. Probably nobody more so than Tony, who's been taking care of both offices for a while here. But we all are, and I know staff is. Board staff had a chance to meet with Will yesterday, and they really liked having that time with you. So it's great. And you'll see this is the meeting where the three of us, at least 3 board members, get to meet with you and everybody at the same time. Other than that, we don't do that. So it's kind of our one big bite at the apple that way. So it can be interesting. Sometimes it can be a little long, but we always appreciate the conversation we have with staff. So it's a good meeting.
Right.
Great. Well, welcome, and we'll see you at our next one too. Any final board comments or questions from Member Vollendroff or Garrett? Seeing none. I don't even look at this. We finished on time, 5 minutes early. Darn, we're good. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to the staff for both the reports and the conversations. Appreciate that. Plenty to follow up with. We'll adjourn the executive management team for July 12th, 2023, and we'll be back next week for a caucus and a board meeting. See you, everybody.